I think it's apt that today's topic is posed as a question, a return to offices. And I think the way I see it, there's a few things in answering this question that are inescapable. Firstly is the variation, particularly across the Pacific, between mainland China, Hong Kong, and the US in how we've emerged from COVID. The speed, the pace, and the approach taken. That's varied, and that will affect, obviously, how we return to the offices or not. Second is a broader shift to flexible work and remote working. This is something that we've seen prior to COVID, but obviously has been sped up by COVID. And thirdly is a balancing between employee wellness and productivity. So I think these are some of the topics I'm looking very much forward to listening to the panelists discuss momentarily. Taken individually, each of these is already a strategic issue of importance to anybody who's invested in real estate, developing real estate, or as a landlord. Taken together, they could be existential threat or offer huge opportunity. So that makes this even more important for us today. There's been much talk about the changing office real estate market since the pandemic began 2.5 years ago. The debate early on in our first discussion was largely whether or not this would be temporary or if this was going to be a permanent shift. 2 years on, it seems like there is a growing consensus, at least in the US, that this is indeed structural. At least that's the impression one would take away from the recent McKinsey study. It came out last week. This study of 25,000 Americans showed that a staggering 58% of American workers were offered at least 1 day of flexible work. And out of this 58%, 87% who were offered chose to take it. So that is a huge number of people who have now gotten used to flexible work. Those of us here in Hong Kong, we're participating in it as well. In mainland China, according to at least what we've seen, a little bit less so. So although this might be a growing consensus in the US, I think those of us here in Hong Kong may not feel quite the same. I'm sure that our speakers today, in particular Vincent Lo, will have a lot to share about that. In Shanghai especially, they've just emerged from 2 months, a mind-bending 2 months of lockdown where they weren't even allowed to leave their homes. So obviously they got used to working from home very quickly. Yet in that market, Hang Lung are seeing very strong take-up of office space. So this is something that I'm sure will be brought out in the discussions later, but I would love to hear. Lastly, there are 2 more topics that I think would be remiss if I didn't mention here. Firstly is sustainability. It's something that everybody is talking about. I'd love to hear what the speakers and the panelists think that sustainability, what role it plays in this return to office. And secondly is, of course, the inflationary world that we're entering. This has perhaps less to do with a return to offices and a little bit more to do with the return of offices. But before I get carried away in my own observations, let me introduce you to the host and the moderator of today's panel, Dr. Richard Green. So I think Richard's on stage right now in Los Angeles. He's both director and chair professor at the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate, and he also teaches across the university's other schools. Previously, he's held positions at George Washington University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and has been a senior advisor and a senior leadership roles of governmental and non-governmental organizations in the US. Richard and I have been on several panels together, including that one mentioned earlier by Anjali. And so I'm thrilled to share the stage again with him, albeit across the Pacific. He's here today with a fantastic panel. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Richard to get to the meat of today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me begin by thanking Anjali for doing such a great job of organizing this Trans-Pacific event. I can't even imagine how you pull such things off because, well, I have no organizational skills, so I really can't imagine how you pull such things off. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I think this is the 3rd or 4th thing I've done with Asia Society since we've gone into the pandemic, and I've always found it very rewarding, the conversations that we've had. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to mention our panelists' name. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves very briefly so they can tell you what they most want you to know about them. I'm going to start with the woman to my left, who is a member of the board of the Lusk Center, among other things, Lindsay Dunn, Executive Vice President of City National Bank. So you could just say a few words about yourself, and then I'm going to ask the others to do the same, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Thanks, Richard. So I run the real estate group for City National Bank, headquartered in Los Angeles. Our parent company is Royal Bank of Canada, and I look forward to the discussion, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Michael Kenderes, Vice President of Real Estate at McKinsey Company, who's coming to us from Singapore.
Yes, good morning from Singapore. I hope you can hear me.
We hear you just fine.
Excellent. Look, as you said, Richard, I'm a Vice President of McKinsey, which translates into a senior expert in real estate. And that's the work that I do for McKinsey with over 30 years experience, and more than 2/3 of that has been in Asia. And prior to McKinsey, I was the head of development for Asia for Lend-Lease, where I spent 29 years. And I serve not just Singapore, but the whole of Southeast Asia and India and Australia. So hopefully I can bring the South Asian perspective to this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. And then James Macdonald, Head of China Research at Savills. James.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, my name is James. I head up research for Savills in China. I've been living here in Shanghai now for the last 20 years, and also the last 2 months as well. And I'm also the chair of the Real Estate Design and Construction Committee for the American Chamber of Shanghai.
So again, thank you all very much for being with us. I think these three countries are particularly interested to look at. One of the things I do for entertainment, which tells you how pathetic my life is I look at GDP tables on a regular basis to see who's leading and who's behind in the standings. And one of the things that occurs to me is that the largest economy in the world on an exchange rate based system of valuing an economy is the United States. The largest economy in the world on a purchasing power parity foundation for valuing an economy is China. And the richest economy in the world on a per capita GDP basis, leaving out places like Qatar and Brunei, who are oil powers, or grand duchies and smaller type countries that are tax havens, so like Luxembourg and Liechtenstein, is Singapore. So Singapore is the richest real economy in the world, is the way I would put it, on a per capita basis. So we really have powerhouses here, and yet I think we're going to hear very profound differences are probably an overstatement, but very real differences in sort of the attitudes toward work from home versus return from the office, and how the evolution of particularly governmental responses toward COVID have formed some of these attitudes, but also how differences in the sort of places people live, the sort of houses people live in, has had an influence. So Jim, could we start with you with a China perspective? So tell us a little bit. I mean, we all know about the lockdown in Shanghai, and to the extent you could comment on how people reacted to that, how it did influence work, and what you see going forward in terms of returning to the office in that very large market.
Okay. Well, obviously, this is not our first lockdown. We went through a lockdown back in 2020 when COVID first emerged. But that lockdown was relatively short-lived. It was over Chinese New Year, so many people on holiday. They weren't working anyway, and then the holidays got pretty much extended for about a week or so. But then the COVID cases were very much centered in Wuhan. They didn't really spread. The transmissibility was much lower, and so the risk was a little bit low. Obviously, we didn't have a way of testing. We didn't know who had it, but you were able to have a relatively short lockdown and then sort of release from that. Obviously, this time was very, very different, much more transmissible, but a lot better in terms of sort of tracking the spread of that. But it was very difficult to look at the transmission mechanisms. And so we went into a very, very hard lockdown, as mentioned. So it was a 2-month lockdown. Initially, the idea was to do I think it was a 4 or 5 day lockdown in Puxi, which is the west of the city, and then 4 or 5 days in Pudong. So it was going to be half the city was locked down. The city wouldn't be in a full lockdown, just half the city at a time. That 4 days then lasted 2 months. And so I think that was one of the more annoying things was the frustration of not knowing how long the lockdown was going to take, and again the extreme extent that the lockdown was actually took. So for the first month, in my situation in Shui and Puxi, I was pretty much confined to my apartment for about a month. And then we're allowed out into our community, our residential community, which is relatively large. I mean, the scale of communities in China can be very, very significant. So my community is about 2,500 people. So we have sort of green landscape locations, which we're allowed to go into, but we weren't allowed to go onto the streets. We weren't allowed to go into shops. We weren't allowed to go into offices. So it was very, very different from that context. And now, after that very, very high lockdown, we're now into a very, very sort of fast return to the office space. So this is my 4th week back in the office. So we came back into the office on about June the 6th. So officially the lockdown finished on June the 1st. We were back in the office on June the 6th. And I've been in the office every day, 5 days a week, 9 o'clock to 7 o'clock. Now that's not the case for every single company, but it is the case for some companies that we feel that we've, or at the moment at least, overcome sort of the COVID situation in Shanghai, and we're able to return to the office with some risk, but not significant risk. And so many people have returned to the office space.
So even if it's not as extreme as what's been going on inside the United States, which we're going to come to, of course, are you seeing some movement to more work from home in Shanghai? Are there companies that are thinking 4 days a week will be the permanent work arrangement going forward, or do you see it just going back to the way things were?
Every company is going to take it slightly differently. I think most companies will come back and try and work 5 days a week. I think some companies, especially multinational corporates, which some of them already had that type of policy because it was brought from overseas into China. It was a worldwide policy that was introduced to all their offices, that some of them already had that sort of degree of flexibility. But I think, again, I mean, our lockdown, while it was extreme, it was only 2 months versus a year or 2 years. And so you couldn't buy furniture to outfit your little study in your office. And so you didn't have a comfortable work environment at home. And so many people do want to return to the office. So it's much more extreme, but it was a lot more short-lived, hopefully, anyway.
Okay, well, and I want to come back to that point, but let's turn to Michael and talk about, let's begin with Singapore, and then we can talk about some of the rest of South Asia. But obviously, the way Singapore has handled COVID has been very different from how China has handled it. Has that had an impact, do you think, on long-term attitudes toward work from home versus return to the office? And what are the dynamics you're seeing in that office market right now?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Look, of course, Singapore's handled it differently. I think overall, Singapore's actually handled the whole COVID lockdown process quite well. It did get surprised a little bit by the 350,000 local domestic construction workers, and that led to a bit more conservatism. But I think coming out since end of April now, it's pretty much everything's back to normal in terms of the way we can live. Some face masks are required essentially when you arrive at the office, but I was in the office this week and it's pretty much back to normal. The impact on the way we work, the future of work, has been significant. I mean, McKinsey Global Institute are predicting that up to 25% of companies are going to move to somewhere between 3 to 5 days a week. This is a global study. I think that's fairly consistent with what's going to happen in Singapore, which is different to the rest of South Asia. In Singapore already, we're seeing policies from companies. So Alibaba, my wife works for Alibaba, they have to come in 3 days a week, but they don't have to come in the other 2 days. So it's already a policy, and most employers are not going in on those extra two days. While McKinsey, we've always had...
Michael, just a quick follow-up on that particular point. Can they pick the 3 days that they go in, or does everybody have to be in the same 3 days?
No, other companies are forcing collaboration on certain days, but no, Alibaba, their employees can come in on any day, any of those 3 days. So,
well, and so is Alibaba moving toward hoteling office space? And clearly, if that's going to be the outcome of this, it has pretty profound implications for the office market.
Yeah, it does. Look, I don't know. I haven't explored that, but I do know, talking to many of my clients here in Singapore that have their global head of real estate based in Singapore, McKinsey's research is showing that we will have a 30% decline for office space generally because of this work from home. However, some organisations are already taking far more drastic steps. I know a large global bank is actually looking at taking a 50% discount on not only their office demand, but also their retail outlets. And this is just a function of work from home, flexible work arrangements, but also decentralizing of workspaces. So what we are seeing offsetting the overall long-term office demand is still the increase of co-working or shared working spaces, especially in those suburban locations where people can still join some of their colleagues within those spaces. Now, there are collaboration and coaching and onboarding sessions that still must happen. So there are still very important functions that happen in the office where everybody needs to come in to those locations.
So, Lindsay, before we talk about how you're underwriting office space, which is what you do for a living, just talk a little bit. We had a brief conversation about how City National Bank is changing how it's thinking about using office space as a consumer of it.
Right. So City National is letting go of space that is rolling, certain space that it's rolling, because we are in a hybrid model with colleagues coming in 2 to 3 days a week. And there's real cost savings that companies can find with this hybrid work model. I have a number of office landlords who are betting on the recession to bring all of the colleagues back into the office, which I think is a fair thought that you will want to be seen if layoffs start occurring in the workspace. But as of the past year, there's been a war on talent, and potential hires are calling the shots. And so if you're not offering that flexible model, they're going to go work for another company that is. But I do see, I think in the U.S. you see the range of the Elon Musk tweet, you must come back into the office, and if you don't, find another job, to I think Yelp announced today that they are going fully remote because they had 2% of colleagues going into their space. So it's definitely an interesting time, and it will be impactful to the office product.
So let's now turn over to what your day job is, which is about you're looking at loan packages and you're deciding what's a go and a no-go. I mean, how are you looking at offices right now, and let's say you have a 2 to 5 year horizon, given the typical length of a real estate loan. Yeah. How are you feeling right now? How are you thinking about that?
I think it's tough. I think there's still so much uncertainty in this product type. But City National as a bank has always been there for our clients, and we look at each deal on a case-by-case basis. So look at the tenant, look at the quality, market, and the sponsor that's backing it, and how much equity is in the deal. And, I would say we're not doing office, but we are more selective. And spec office is challenging right now.
So when you're looking at things like loan to cost, has that changed a lot in the last, say, 2 years?
Especially, things have changed significantly in the past, 90 to 120 days, with rates increasing. Where is that going to put cap rates? And it's more challenging time, and it's amazing how much the pendulum has swung in a quick time span.
So, Jim, I want to come back to you and sort of the situation in China on what workers are looking for. And again, you have a better sense of how much power workers have in terms of dictating terms relative to workers in Singapore or the U.S. Yeah. But, talk a little bit about the kind of houses that people in Shanghai are living in and why maybe the office is not such a bad place for them to go.
Yeah, so when we had our conversation earlier, we were talking about sort of why would people want to come back into the office space? And for many people, obviously depending upon your position within the company, what your salary is, but many people will still be living in relatively small apartments. Obviously we've got 24 million people living in one city, so not everybody can have a detached house. Most people are living in apartments. Sometimes the apartments can be relatively small. On a gross floor area basis, the average size is around about 100 square meters. That's a sort of a 2-bedroom apartment, but you may have sort of 3 generations living in that apartment. I mean, not in all cases, but you're not likely to have a private study room in your apartment. It's likely to be 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a kitchen, maybe. And so the the comfort or the ability to spread yourself out and have different workspaces, different living spaces, different places for kids' education. So one of the other things we have to understand is that in Shanghai during this lockdown, we didn't have any schools. So you had kids, you had maybe your parents, and you had to work as well, all within the confines of maybe sort of 100 to 150 square meter apartments. So for a lot of people, it was a very challenging period of time. And so we haven't had that period of time when the kids are being off at school, but then you've been working at home. So I've got a 9-year-old son. And so if he was off at school, then the apartment would be a lot quieter and I'd be able to work a lot easier at home. But during this two-month period, it's not been that type of environment. And so many people's experience of working at home hasn't been necessarily what people have experienced in the West in terms of kids off at school, you're at home, you've got quiet space that you can work, you've got your coffee set up, you've got everything sort of perfectly arranged for you to be able to be productive at work. For many people, they've been juggling many different things, and so it hasn't been productive. And employers have seen that as well. And so I don't think we've seen initially when the rest of the world went into lockdown, productivity dropped quite significantly because everybody was dealing with ordering food and sort of doing everything else. And we've never recovered to that sort of higher productivity level working from home. And so managers are saying, look, we need to get people back into the office to increase productivity as well. And touching on Lindsay's point as well, I mean, the economy in China at the moment is not particularly strong. Unemployment levels in the 16 to 24-year-old demographic are apparently up at 18%, whereas the urban surveyed unemployment is closer to about 6%. And so we are starting to see the economy facing quite significant challenges. And so I think the strength in terms of negotiating power is really with the employers at the moment versus the employees.
So I can't help but ask that question before I move on to Michael. Follow up with that, ask a question following that statement. So you think the slowdown in China is a cyclical or secular phenomenon? And the reason I ask is, I mean, this is, when I was young, I learned that Germany was going to eat America's lunch because it was growing, 8 to 10% a year. And then it matured and it slowed down to 2 to 3. And then it was Japan was going to overtake us because they were growing 8 to 10% a year. And then they slowed down to actually like 1 to 2. And there's a point where economies just mature. And it's very difficult at that point for them to generate large amounts of employment. So is China getting to that point, or are we still a ways away from, is China still a ways away from facing that?
Well, I think we're obviously facing sort of structural and cyclical at the same time. So some of the cyclical things may be addressed, but some of the structural things may take longer to address. For the last 3 or 4 years, we've been trying to financially de-risk the economy. So we've been looking at the levels of debt within certain sectors of the economy and trying to deleverage those sectors. Obviously, that's had a lot of pain for particular sectors like real estate, where we've seen obviously bonds and share prices, offshore and onshore as well, fall quite significantly, and the ability for companies to refinance, repayments and everything else have been particularly challenging for real estate developers. But that's also been challenging for other sectors of the economy as well, where they haven't been able to get access to the cheap financing that not cheap financing, but access to the quantums in terms of financing that we were previously used to. We are starting to see, so the economy is faced with a slightly different perspective where we're actually reducing interest rates versus increasing interest rates. Our inflation levels are really quite manageable. The CPI is around about 2.5%. Interest rates are sort of 4.5%. So they're actually coming down from a relatively high level. So we may have monetary support for a recovering economy, but we do have other structural issues within the economy, which we're trying to address, but we can't address during the sort of cyclical downturn at the moment. So we're taking a pause on that, and maybe in a back step from that in terms of sort of the overall sort of trying to restructure the debt within the economy at the moment. And there's also this big point in terms of sort of trying to reweight the economy towards domestic consumption and everything else, which you can't really do if you're seeing incomes being cut. Or sort of not seeing that income growth as well. So there's a number of challenges in that transition away from the previous China growth model to a new China growth model.
So Michael, tell us what kind of, is there a problem with people finding talent in Singapore the way there is in the U.S. and therefore do employees have a kind of ability to get their demands in a way that was not the case 5-10 years ago? And where would people in Singapore rather be? Would they rather be at home, or are their homes reasonably big and nice and they can put their kids somewhere else while they're working, or would they rather be in the office?
Look, I think there is a war on talent in Singapore and across Asia, just like there is around the world. So, and that's why we are seeing companies bring in flexible work agreements. And, McKinsey believes 37% and up to 37% of companies will do that globally. And I think that's the same across South Asia. I think your question about where Singaporeans like to live, look, we have a very broad spectrum of accommodation here, but the majority of Singaporeans, 80%, live in HDB, and they have the similar living conditions and concerns that you have in China. So really what the employees like, though, is the flexibility, the choice, and that's what employers are giving them, rather than saying, it'll give a search you to come in 5 days, please come in 5 days. In fact, the government encourages all employees to come into the office 5 days. It is completely different, however, outside of Singapore. I travel to Ho Chi Minh regularly, and everyone is back at work. It's nothing has changed. I'm also working for some of the largest developers in India at the moment and actually looking at their new office building design. And we're not seeing a lot change. I mean, through COVID, we had a lot of clients come to us and say, what is the future of office? You know, what design changes should we be making? Should we be looking at more naturally ventilated buildings, more terraces, open air, more air change, filtering of air? The only things we're seeing really is air change and crowding in lift lobbies. That's the only thing that we're seeing. And Lindsay will probably support this, I think, if you try to build in too much future-proofing, it costs more money and less efficiency, and therefore, from a valuation point of view, you are going to fall behind. But we are going to have future pandemics of different sorts, and I think what Adriel mentioned is the other future-proofing element is decarbonisation, and I think there is a new office product which will need to be more flexible and more future-proof. I don't know if we've got the right answer on trying to make sure that we don't get the assets don't get priced out because of too much flexibility and too much cost. But with decarbonisation, especially in the operating footprint, I think there are ways to offset that future proofing. So that's what we're sort of generally seeing in the market here.
So I'm curious, since you hit on India and one of the issues that Mr. Chan raised was sustainability, air quality in Delhi is just appalling. Climate change seems to be having a particularly profound impact on Delhi in particular, but other cities in India. Are you going to see mass migration? Bangalore is already, I would argue, the most successful city in India. Are you going to start seeing mass migration away from places that face these enormous environmental challenges in India toward the places that are just more pleasant?
Yeah, look, this is more my personal observation. I think urbanization is still very strong in India and many South Asian countries because that's where the work is, that's where the highest salaries are. I think what we are seeing, and we also have seen this in China as well, is that buildings are going to make sure that air quality is filtered. There's going to be more money spent on making sure that you can filter the air. It comes back to the well rating that we're seeing in the top grade, premium grade offices. So I think that's where you'll see, I think it's difficult. It will be a slow change in terms of reducing the overall air quality in these major cities, but the short-term change will be actually improving the filtering of the air.
So Lindsay, let me ask you about, we just heard of maybe a 37% reduction in the need for office space worldwide. That's a really large number. How does your bank look at conversions or scrapes with successive land uses?
I think that's where we have to look, and we're seeing conversions of Class B office into multifamily, and we definitely provide capital in doing so. The problem with conversions is you don't know what you don't know until you find it, and that can be challenging. But we're seeing it in urban cities across the U.S. and I think we have to be open to that because I just don't think the need will be there long term for the amount of office we have today, especially Class B.
The other thing, and I'm just thinking out loud with this question, so this is unfair, I'm going to spring this on you, but it occurs to me when part of the appeal of working in office buildings or not working in office buildings is where you're coming from and how far you have to go. So we heard about housing conditions. And by the way, I think the Housing Development Board stuff at Singapore is pretty nice. I visited it, and I wish that we would do that here in the U.S. So it seems okay to me. But But here in the U.S., I mean, one of my favorite statistics is we in LA think, and we in fact do have a housing shortage, right? Vacancies are near zero. But we have more bedrooms than people in Los Angeles. So in a sense, we have plenty of housing in LA. It's configured wrong, but we have loads of housing. And that's, in Europe and Asia, they would find it astonishing that a place with more bedrooms than people could be a place that has a housing shortage, which is the way of saying the typical house in the US is really pleasant. What's not so that's a reason to stay. And then the other thing, of course, in a place like LA or New York, getting to work is kind of a miserable experience. Could you imagine a world where for companies that really want people in the office, because they do think that collaboration matters, that they're going to places with shorter commutes as a way to make it less unappealing for Americans to go to work in office buildings?
I think we're seeing that today. I think companies are creating these suburban hubs, smaller hubs, instead of just having, one large headquarters with all of their employees in that space, because the commute is real in some large cities across the U.S. And after employees have been able to enjoy not dealing with that commute, it's tough to go back to it. I think psychologically it's really tough for to shift the number of bedrooms available compared to the housing shortage. And I think that's the same for going back to the office. We have conversations with our clients or our colleagues saying, if you only want to come back to the office 2 days a week, then you might have to share your office. And that's like, they can't imagine having to share their space, but you can't have both. And so it's shifting that mindset. And it's gonna take time. And, I do think that office is important, and I think collaboration is important. I was at the office today and seeing, analysts working together and being at their desks together and working through issues. That does not happen as easily from a work from home standpoint. And in terms of retention, we saw more attrition at our company from colleagues that started during the pandemic and hadn't gotten to really truly experience our culture and connectivity. So, I don't know. We'll see. I'm not sure where it's going to go, but it's important.
So here's a question I want to ask all three of you. We know that there are enormous benefits to being in the office from a productivity standpoint, and it is collaboration, and that's real. There's an urban economist at Berkeley named Enrico Moretti who wrote this terrific book about 10 years ago called The New Geography of Work. And by the way, if you're going to read one book in urban economics, and it is a fun book too, by the way. Well, at least to me it was. I would read that book more than Ed Glazer's Triumph of the City, which is also really good. But what Moretti shows is for certain tasks, people of like skills being together really matters. And what he did is he did the following experiment. He looked at, take a software engineer who moves from Cleveland to Silicon Valley. What happens to their patent productivity? It increases by, if I remember correctly, something like 13%. So it's being around those other engineers that motivate. So it's the same person, right? So you're controlling for their native intelligence and their education, all that stuff. They're just, and vice versa, if they move from Silicon Valley to St. Louis, they lose that productivity. So there are tasks where being together clearly matters, but not necessarily all the time. Because part of doing work is also putting your head down and not talking to other people and getting your work done, right? Writing stuff up, for example. And that can maybe be better done in an environment of solitude and you can pet your dog and it helps you relax a little, and so you get more writing done. So with that setup, or your cat or your iguana or whatever happens to be your thing, for most office work, and obviously there's heterogeneity here, but for most office works, what would you think the ideal work arrangement would be? How many days in the office, how many days away from the office? And I know I'm putting you on the spot, but I'm just curious, this is entirely, what does your gut tell you about that? And I'll start with Jim on this one.
I mean, if I could use a sort of general consultant one, it's a case-by-case basis. I think it's really hard to say. I mean, I agree with your perspective. Like, I have my research team. I love talking to them. They challenge my assumptions. It really helps me to sort of develop ideas. But I also think it's also, so just to touch and elaborate upon that, I think it's also important because I work in a brokerage company pretty much, and so it's also really useful to have different people's perspective as well. So we see it from purely a research perspective. We look at the numbers, we look at everything else, and the brokers will see it from a very sort of different angle as well. So I think it's also important not to just be with like-minded people, but just to be with people that can inform you about and expand your sphere in terms of knowledge and understanding about what's going on in the world. So I think that's also incredibly important. Touching upon sort of the best ratio, I think it probably it really depends not necessarily upon the industry or the company, but the personality of the individual and their other responsibilities. If you're a single mother and you've got home responsibilities, then a company that gives you the flexibility to be able to arrange your work-life balance is incredibly important. And you're likely to be more engaged with the business, so the business gives you the flexibility to be able to compartmentalize the different components of your life. If you're a 22-year-old graduate, you want to be in the office every single day. You want to be sort of working as hard as you can. You want to be putting the hours. And so I think it's based upon sort of your point in terms of your career and sometimes your personality, your home situation. So I don't think it's necessarily about the business, but about the individuals. And so if you're a company and you're looking at employing a certain type of individual, then you need to make sure that the office environment that you're providing is the best suited to that type of individual, if that makes sense.
So I'm sure, Michael, that McKinsey has a matrix of some sort to try to figure this out. So, Michael, what's your gut reaction to that question?
Well, look, the first fact is that different industries need different levels of collaboration. So I think each industry and the type of work and the functions that those workers do, you need to work out what is the right level of collaboration. Because even pre-COVID, we were already talking to our clients about forced agility. And agility is the amount of time that workers are away from the office due to all sorts of leave. So I know at McKinsey, our agility ratio in some offices is up to 90%, meaning that 90% of the staff are never there because they're traveling or they're on other forms of leave. So that's an industry where we were already working from home. So before COVID. But there are other industries where, as you said, and I felt the same frustration during COVID. In real estate, when you're probably solving real estate problems, we could have saved probably 5 times more efficient if we could actually sit around the room with the right skills and solve problems. And I was actually saying I can't wait to get back to my clients because I get involved in very mega projects and solving problems. So again, that's just an example of where different industries and different functions and different problems require different levels of collaboration. But I think the key word, I don't think there's a right number, Richard. What I do think, though, it needs to be flexible. If companies are not providing flexible work agreements, they are going to miss out. So as James said, if you're on paternity leave or you've got young kids, there needs to be flexibility. I don't think we can write very fixed policies. My general feel is that 3 days is probably the right, 3 to 4 days is the right amount. But the best companies, what we're seeing, is those that are harnessing diversity. So if we can harness diversity in different ways and flexibly, then those companies are going to retain and attract the best talent.
You hit on something sort of inadvertently that may be particularly important, and that is there are times you're neither in the office or at home. You're on the road. And you have me thinking about this because for academics, summer is conference season, and starting next week, I'm going to be gone for 5 weeks, not at home, not at the office. And this phenomenon was driving before the pandemic a reduction in demand for office space that had obviously nothing to do with the pandemic. So how much travel snaps back presumably is going to have a pretty big impact on office demand going forward.
Exactly.
Lindsay, what's your magic ratio?
I'm going to go for 3 days a week. I think
at home or in the office?
At 3 days in the office. Yeah.
That one takes away.
Yes. But I think it's all about the people. And when you find the right people, you need to be flexible. And So it is more of a case-by-case basis, but I do think we have to be flexible going forward. Because just to the panelist's point, to allow a parent to be able to pick up their child from school and take off 45 minutes to do so makes a big difference for them personally. And then typically they're fine working that extra time later on in the day. And I think it's important to allow for that.
So I've been monopolizing this conversation. Do we have any questions that have come in via Zoom for the panel? Okay, do we have any questions from the audience at this point for the panel?
I'd like to know from the McKinsey report, if you guys quantified what the actual productivity difference is between remote, office, and hybrid models.
Yes, look, I can refer to one study, but it was done in COVID. We did see an increased productivity of about 16%, but that was partially offset by the investment in capabilities. So what we've been seeing through COVID is that what companies we've been trying to do to retain and attract talent is actually focused, especially on the retention side, is focused on building capabilities for the workers through remote, and especially in technology and digital. So we've seen basically an uplift in about 11% on digital capabilities as well.
So, but that's an interesting, that's a big number. And I will tell you the one study that I've seen that I found very convincing was studying telemarketing in China. It was a Harvard Business School study. And despite that, I found it convincing. And what they found is telemarketers in China were about 9% more productive working at home than they were in the office. Now, if you think about it, there is a place where collaboration is not a particularly important part of the job. I mean, I'm sure still you talk to the guy in the cube next to you, and maybe you have an idea. But basically, your job is to dial and to close. And it may be that, again, I'm big on, I get a lot of stress relief when my cat sits on my lap. So I'm big on that. It's got to make you more productive. So that particular context, it made sense to me because it was a task where collaboration is of minimal importance and you're more comfortable. And just when you're more comfortable, chances are you're going to dial more numbers and be in a better mood when you're talking to people and so on. But so your 16% number was really, strikes me as profound. And what's striking to me about it, and I'd be curious about how your management teams where you work feel about this, is I was talking about this issue with a senior manager of a large real estate firm here in Southern California yesterday. And this person just rejected, and I said, we need to study productivity better, having not read your study yet, so I'm going to take a look at that. And this person said, I don't care what a study says. I want people back to work. It's irrelevant to me. I want them in the office. And it's like nothing that could be given would have made this person have a different point of view about whether people need to be in the office or not. And so, again, how is management going to react to this? Are they going to insist, or are they going to eventually go with the flow? And maybe you're just seeing management in general is already not, other than Elon Musk being the famous example. So, I mean, thoughts about just management attitudes toward all of this, regardless of what productivity numbers might say, for anybody.
Yeah. I mean, why don't I respond first, because this is a conversation we're having with clients. So the really important bit here is making sure that there are shared and aligned KPIs and they're very clear. Because if they are set really clearly, then it's not about where you work and how much you work. It's about making sure that you can meet your KPIs. Now, the collaboration piece, however, that's the piece where you have to force collaboration so that you get better results and you get innovation. So that bit still hasn't been, we're still trying to get our head around that. But I don't think anyone is saying that you cannot go to work. Like, I think that's why we're saying a minimum of 3 days. So that's where you manage that collaboration and innovation.
So James, do you have any thoughts?
I think a lot of the management in China will tend to sort of require staff to come back into the office, irrespective of what any studies say. So I think they are. I do think that is the case, that there's a mistrust in terms of sometimes analysis. It's their own personal belief that really sort of drives the company. Some of the companies are being sort of founded from the bottom up. So you've got the founder who's still the CEO, and he believes that I bought this company from nothing to here, therefore I know exactly what's right. And so sort of Elon Musk style, I guess.
I would also just add that most of our real estate investor developer clients have been back at the office with their entire teams 5 days a week throughout the pandemic until now, because this is their lifeblood, and they need to continue to prove that up.
Yes, sir.
Could you or your panelist colleagues give us some data points and forecasts? So what has happened to Price B office space in the United States over the last couple of years? Is it down 10%, down 30%? And what's your forecast for where it'll be 2 years from now, 2 to 3 years from now, or a range?
Okay, I'm going to, before I give my answer, I'm going to let panelists weigh in on what's happening in their markets. What's happening to rents in South Asia? What's happening to rents in China? And Lindsay, what are you seeing happening to rents here? It's a great question.
I mean, in South Asia, we haven't seen a big decline yet because a lot of renewals haven't happened, but we will. I mean, across all the IPCs, we're already in discussions with them. We're seeing that, and it's a consolidation to quality. I mean, that's so it's both consolidation and it's going to quality, but it's also decentralization. So, but yes, we are seeing a decline in rent, and what we're seeing is an uptick in, especially in Singapore, even in the news this morning, office transactions are happening. So others are seeing opportunities for buying in at a good price and maybe repurposing or maybe seeing an uptick. So I think everyone's got different views. Valuations, I don't have those figures for South Asia at the top of my fingertips, sorry.
James?
For me, it's quite hard to comment. Obviously, our sort of most recent lockdown was relatively recent, so we haven't seen an adjustment in terms of rents yet. But what I would say is that over the last year, we've actually seen an increase in rents in markets like Shanghai, because again, we returned to normal. After the initial lockdown in 2020, the second half of 2020 was great. The economy was very strong, and so rents were actually increasing. I think what's going to have much more of an impact in terms of values and rents is really going to be the state of the economy versus sort of utilization rates of the actual office space.
And whatever, I mean, Hong Kong had the most expensive office rents in the world. What's happening in Hong Kong?
I don't cover Hong Kong.
Okay, all right. Sorry about that.
No worries, just mainland China.
Okay, Lindsay?
You know, I think transaction volume has dropped on office sales, but for the sales that we see for the right product, they're holding up, and we're seeing still really strong numbers. You know, I would say that absorption has slowed, and concessions are up. Where we're at in 3 years from now, you know.
So my answer is that the pandemic accelerated a trend that was happening in office anyway. I mean, downtown office outside of San Francisco and Manhattan was already not doing well in the US. I mean, rents here in downtown LA are no different than they were 30 years ago. And I mean, I don't mean inflation adjusted, I mean nominal rents. And vacancies here are high. I mean, in this building, unless there's been a big lease signed recently, there's a lot of vacancy where we're sitting right now. I mean, part of it is work from home. Part of it is densifying office space was happening very rapidly before the pandemic hit. We went from a typical office worker using about 220 square feet of space in the US to about 160. And that was, and the only reason it was at 160 is leases still hadn't turned over yet. And so I've been, just like I've been gloomy on retail for I finally reached a point where I'm not gloomy on retail. And the reason is we've finally gotten rid of enough crap that I think we're kind of getting close to being where retail should be in the US. Maybe not quite, but we were absurdly over retailed 15 years ago, and everything was working against retail as a sector. Similarly, sort of what I'll call commodity office space, we had too much of it. And to the point about conversion, I mean, we see a company like Rexford, big industrial company, they're buying office buildings whose sole purpose is, the whole sole purpose for the purchase is to tear them down and put up industrial space. Now think about that you're scraping an office building to put up a warehouse. That would have been unimaginable 20 to 30 years ago. So the big issue to me, and I don't know the answer to this, is when we look at sort of these centers of agglomeration like San Francisco, like Manhattan, like Santa Monica, I would put in this category. Will they return as being those very special kind of centers of agglomeration and therefore command these remarkable rents that they were $100 a square foot a year rents that they were commanding before the pandemic? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet. But in general, the B office sector is toast. And a lot of stuff that might have been called A is probably going to stagger along too, is my view. And that's for reasons that have nothing to do with the pandemic. Okay, here's a really good question. During the pandemic, work from home has pushed up the U.S. housing market. Given the rising interest rate environment, has the U.S. housing market peaked? Will there be a downturn in the next 1 to 3 years? So presumably that's for me, but if one of you guys want to step in, go ahead, because I'm just your humble moderator. I'm not supposed to be. I've already given. Yes. I don't think it's going to crash. This is not 2005, 2006, in that the share of mortgages that were being made that were just really bad mortgages in 2005, 2006, home mortgages was about 20%. So pay option arms, interest-only loans, no underwriting, that's just, those products are gone. That's a really important difference. The amount of home equity people have is much larger than it was in 2005 and 2006. And the really important fundamental is, unlike 15 years ago when apartment rents were kind of flat, rents have gone up a lot too. So house prices are not absurd. Certainly were very, quote unquote, reasonable 6 months ago in a 3%, 3.5% mortgage rate environment. If you looked at the choice between owning and renting, owning still looked like a good choice even with the inflated values. That's no longer true. But for what it's worth, I think inflation-adjusted house prices will come down 5 to 10% in the next year. But I don't know what inflation is going to be. So if inflation is 8%, then nominal house prices, what we actually observe, will still go up a little bit. If inflation is 3%, then I think the house prices we observe will go down. But there's no vacancy. We're not building a lot. Mortgages are very well underwritten and very vanilla product. So it's hard to see an enormous contraction, but small contraction, absolutely. Okay, this is a good question that my panelists can answer. And let me just see. Ashley, where are we on time? What? Last question, got it. What does WeWork and its competitors do differently in the U.S., the PRC, and Singapore during or beyond COVID? So sort of the co-working sort of space. I'm just going to make that a more generic question. How has that been affected, and what do you see for that going forward? And maybe I'm going to start with Lindsay on this one because you've always gone last, and then I will go to Michael and James to finish up.
I'm not sure I have a lot to add because we've always avoided looking at financing projects with co-working space because we're never that comfortable in that space.
She's a good banker.
But on the other hand, I think there's a space for co-working going forward. Is it to the extent of the WeWork leasing that transpired? Maybe not, but I do think there's a home for it.
I absolutely agree, and we're seeing that only adds to a different, flexible product type, and it's a very much a low-cost model for tenants, where you can secure a permanent, smaller space in a co-working office, and then have that flexibility for all your agility and your collaboration days. So, as a future of work business model for a lot of tenants, it's going to be very much in demand, is our view.
Last word.
Yeah, I tend to agree with some of the other people on the call. But what I would say is that we have very different models coming out of China. So some of them were very much more about taking up excess vacancy within the office space. The landlord doesn't know what to do with it. Then you get an operator to come in and actually take that space up and then take the requirements in terms of actually leasing out on behalf of the landlord. So that's what we saw from a very local perspective in terms of local operators coming in. So it was a very different model. They claimed they were co-working, but they weren't properly co-working.
So, and with that, we're going to move on to our fireside chat now. Let's give a round of applause to James, Michael, and Lindsay. Thank you very much for your insightful comments. It is my great pleasure to be spending time again virtually with one of the legends of real estate development in China, Vincent Lo. Vincent is someone who I think needs no introduction to this group, right? Everybody knows who he is. He's done remarkable work, large-scale development work of a scale that we can't even imagine in the United States, I think it's fair to say, in China and Hong Kong. And it's great to have him talk to us about these issues that we've just been talking about to get his views. So let's start with Vincent. Just tell us what you've been up to lately with your company.
I was just going to say, the property market in China is going through a very tough time. It's been a perfect storm, and with all the debt issues and the correction in the market, I'm actually quite excited and anticipating that will be a lot of good buys going forward. And I'm sort of gearing up my company, waiting for the opportunities, because I'm sure there's going to be quite a bit of fire sale. The debt situation is not looking any better because the transaction volume has been falling quite a bit. Last month, it started to pick up a little, but nothing compared to before. So a lot of these highly geared companies, I think, will have problems going forward. So it's exciting times.
So when you talk about opportunities and fire sales, so you think of buying the debt directly and then foreclosing, or do you walk us through a little bit about the process of when you see these opportunities, how you take advantage of it?
Yeah. Well, I think, for example, we have been working with a bank in Shanghai recently on the possibility of acquiring a sort of bad loan that they have on their books. And then this bad loan is with quite a good location properties that we're interested in. But we have to work with them on actually, okay, what sort of a deal can we make with them? Because I don't want to be carrying the debt. I want to make sure that we are buying the properties and we don't have any trouble. Because in the last cycle, I did purchase some properties and we ended up in court for over 10 years. And that's not what we want.
So you're reminding me of in the days after the savings and loan crisis here in the U.S., we had the Resolution Trust Corporation, whose purpose was basically to allow people to buy bad debt off the balance sheets of dead financial institutions. But they made it very easy then to acquire the property. Nobody could sue at that point. Basically, the RTC allowed you to acquire the debt, which in turn meant you acquired the property. You were buying the debt. You weren't paying the debt.
Yeah, that's right. So we have to go through that whole process because it's still relatively new inside China on this sort of situation, because the property market in the past 20, 30 years has been absolutely booming. I think this time it's going to be the biggest hit for our industry.
So when you say the property market, are you talking about sort of all major food groups of real estate, or are there some in particular?
Basically, the residential market has been down almost 50%. And then the offices, I think in a lot of second, third tier cities, the offices have been overbuilt. Even in Shanghai, there's been a lot of supply, but the CBDs and the good locations are no problem. Our assets are all over 90% occupied.
So what about industrial space?
Industrial space, it's not really for developers because there's quite a bit of land inside the mainland that the industrialists, they all get land from the government direct, and they don't really require developer to do the work for them. So we're not involved into the industrial side at all.
So on the theme of what the panel was about, just coming back to office for a second, what's your view of work from home or return to the office? Do you see that becoming a phenomenon in China? We just heard from James that he thinks because of the way companies tend to be run in China, it's not going to have the big, at least this is my interpretation of his remarks, it's not going to have the big impact there that it's having in the US and even in Singapore.
Not for the time being, but I think the trend must be work with flexibility, especially for the capable people. I think they want convenience. And in my own company, for example, we're thinking of allowing our employees to at least have 1 day flexibility that they can work from home or work from anywhere. But of course, the data security is something that we are concerned about, but I think that can be fixed. So let me maybe share with you my thoughts, our thoughts on the company. We are one of the biggest commercial property owner in Shanghai. And what we are planning to do is that we want to allow our tenants in the offices to have more flexibility in their location, particularly from the workers' point of view. So let's say 1 day a week, the staff can work from anywhere, not necessarily from home, because just now James was saying the conditions that people live in are not, are not so conducive for them to work from home conveniently. So what we're also planning is that in our developments, for example, in the clubhouse, we will cut out a certain section where people can go and work there with a bit of peace and quiet. And then for our office tenants, we actually have quite a lot of locations that they can have a small, something like a WeWork office that our tenants can share. And we just charge them maybe by the hour so that they can allow their staff to go and work there if they want to. So convenience and flexibility, I think, is going to be the future.
So we talked a little bit in a pre-call about the lockdown in Shanghai and how it went or how it didn't go. I mean, do you think that has had a permanent change on people's attitude toward how they're going to use real estate going forward? Do you think people are going to forget all about it within, if we go for a period of time without a lockdown, will it just sort of be a blip in terms of the evolution of real estate use in Chinese cities, and particularly in Shanghai where it was so severe? What do you think are the long-term consequences of the lockdown?
I think with the lockdown, people are starting to realize that they need to upgrade their living conditions, right? Of course, flats are not as big, but I think we are looking at a lot of people who want to improve on their living environment. With the lockdown, if you're locked in a 50-meter flat with a family of 3 or 4, I think you're going to have trouble, particularly with your wife. So I think it's actually, we're seeing that, people want to upgrade on the residential side. But for the offices, we are starting to see domestic companies wanting to rent Grade A offices in the CBDs. It's no longer all multinationals, especially now with what's happening, Sino-US relations, and the West is putting pressure on China. So I don't expect multinationals to be expanding anytime soon.
Well, and so one of the things we talked about is how is deglobalization, which is a phenomenon that's almost surely happening at the moment, how is that influencing the real estate market in China right now? Is it, I mean, the domestic market is so huge that maybe this doesn't matter so much, but things like the supply chain and the throughput that goes through the industrial property and the ports and so on, that has to be influenced by this.
Of course, there's pressure on deglobalization, but I don't believe that will be the trend going forward, because the world is so used to having good quality stuff at reasonable prices, right? I'm sure the West, particularly US, is trying to replace China on the supply chain, but look at China in the past couple of years, export has gone up, right? Last year, despite the high tariff that the Trump administration has imposed on China goods, export to the U.S. was 504 billion, roughly about 50% of the imports for the U.S. And it's not going to decrease anytime soon. Where are you going to find the replacement, right? China has established a very good ecosystem on the manufacturing side, and I don't expect anytime soon that you can replace that. So, particularly on the quality.
Yeah, anytime soon that's surely the case. But something we talk about is there is a history of manufacturing going to the low-cost place to do the manufacturing, and we talk about in textiles started in England, and then they moved to New England, and then they moved to the American South, and then they moved to East Asia, and then they moved to China, and now they've moved to Vietnam and Bangladesh. And so there's just this natural evolution as countries become more expensive. Korea used to be a manufacturing juggernaut. They do much less of it now because it's too expensive to do the manufacturing there. China is surely reaching a point where it's getting expensive enough that it will start to lose some of that to other countries just because that's a natural phenomenon with respect to where manufacturing goes in the world.
That's happening, but China is a big country, and along the coast, it's getting more and more expensive. But if you go inland, you still can get quite reasonable cost of labor. But of course, people are moving some of their manufacturing to Vietnam, Indonesia, and all these places, also for political reasons, right? And also the domestic market is something that a lot of manufacturers are also looking at. So all these will happen, and I expect China to be continuing to go up the value chain. I think that's the only way to really make it worthwhile, right? In the past 30, 40 years, just doing this assembly line, like doing the iPhone, it really doesn't contribute too much to the GDP at all.
So I want to go back.
I think the world is going to go through that. But I don't expect globalization to be going backwards anytime soon.
That's an interesting perspective. So, because we hear incessantly here in the U.S. that it's going backwards, and if it is, it's certainly one of the foundations of inflation, right? Because if you do things less efficiently, the price level has to rise, and reversal of globalization means, by definition, less efficient production processes.
Yeah, that's right. And the China sort of supply chain I emphasized just now, it's so efficient. I don't expect any country can really replace that, particularly with the size of the labor force, right? Okay, you go to Vietnam. How big is Vietnam? It's not even as big as Guangdong province.
Yeah, it's like 100 million people, right? Yeah. Yeah.
So, how do you replace that? But of course, for political reasons, people will have to go and set up their manufacturing locally. But that's actually good for the world, that the developing countries will have a chance to catch up.
So I want to remind people, if they have a question for Vincent, to put it, if you're on Zoom, put it in the chat. Otherwise, you can let Anjali know or give her a card. I want to come back to what you said about how people want to upgrade their housing in China. That one of the outcomes of the pandemic is people desiring nicer, and I think specifically larger housing. You talked about the 50 square meter house. So for we Americans, that's 550 square feet, which is incredibly small by U.S. standards. Okay, given the slowdown of the domestic economy for the time being in China, how do people afford that bigger house? And given how expensive land values are in the coastal cities of China anyway, where do these bigger houses get built? Where do they, and I know there's going to be flats, they're not going to be single family houses, but where do you go so that people can have a little more space, and how do they afford that space?
Well, I think the Chinese people, we always love property. So every family, the first and most important thing for them to consider is how they can continue to upgrade on their living the flats that they have. I have that experience even in my own company. My secretary, she's worked for me for over 20 years, and she said she's already purchased 5 flats. Right? And,
you find that you find that a little frightening?
Not holding to the flats all at the same time. She's doing the upgrading.
Oh, okay. All right.
Right? So every time prices go up, she will sell the previous one and buy a bigger one.
Okay. That makes sense to me. The reason that made me is it's very famously the case that when the U.S. had its, in the run up to its housing crash, you had things like tax. In fact, I had a taxi driver who told me he owned 9 houses. And that was one of those moments when it was 2005. I was in Atlanta. I remember, I'll never forget the moment. I thought, man, this is bad. What's going to come is going to be really bad. So if she's just upgrading, okay, that makes sense. But you just said residential property values have fallen. So how are people going to have the equity in order to do the upgrading?
It's only fallen by a little bit in the last few months, not much, probably a couple of percentage points. But in cities like Shanghai, it's still going up a little because Shanghai is like New York and London. Everybody wants to own a piece of property there.
Right, and that's why, in Shanghai, I'm trying. I find it hard to figure out how people get bigger houses in Shanghai, given how expensive it is and given how little land that remains in the desirable parts of the city.
No, well, in Shanghai, it's like everywhere else. Prices go up and then the flats will get smaller. There's no alternative.
Yeah.
Right. So, but still, at least I think Shanghai still has land. And we're building, for example, in the city center next to the Kenderes, we have the 6th phase of our Lakeview there. It was recently launched, and people have to put a goodwill money down with us of 10 million just for the right to ballot to buy a flat in our development.
10 million RMB.
Renminbi, yes, just for the right to ballot.
Wow.
And they have to qualify with the government on the number of points that they score.
So
that's how demanding it is.
So one of the things that, so if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a really big picture question about real estate in China, that something that confuses a lot of us is when you look at incomes in China, when you look at house prices in China, they don't line up with each other. So there are all kinds of people who do these ratios. So like the typical house in China is 20 to 25 times the typical annual income. And to put that in perspective, here in LA, where we think we have a very unaffordable market, we do, it's more like 6 to 7 times annual income. So how does that work? How do people figure out how to get into the housing market with the ratio being as large as that?
Richard, I'm not sure if the figure you quoted was correct. I don't think it's high as that, for sure. And also, I think maybe in Shanghai and Beijing, it could be a bit high, but not in a lot of the other cities. And what's amazing is that in the savings account in China, the last time I saw, it's 160 trillion in savings account. And these money are earning negative interest. So what they would like to do is to put that into properties, if the government will allow them. The last couple of years in Shanghai, there's so much restriction on people buying flats, right? You need to basically have to score a certain number before you can even go for a queue up on balloting.
So that was, so those numbers were actually specifically for Shanghai and Beijing, and they come from a group called Numbeo, which does relocation, tells companies how much they have to pay people if they're relocating people. But it's possible that they're not correct either. When I saw them, they blew my mind. So that's why I'm asking you the question. So Anjali, I'm sorry, I don't have my reading glasses on, and I can't read this card. So from the audience, so if you wouldn't mind.
Vincent was a visionary 3 decades or more with respect to Shanghai PRC real estate development. Today it would be impossible to replicate something on the scale of Xintiandi, but if a 30-year-old Vincent was handed 15 square kilometers of land in, say, Hangzhou, how would Vincent envision this development of the future?
Great question. Sorry, I couldn't read it.
Okay, I didn't get the full question, but I guess it's talking about the Xintiandi. In the past 20 years, I developed that 50 hectares right in the heart of Shanghai. It's almost complete now. If I'm offered a similar opportunity in Hangzhou, I wouldn't be just replicating what I did in Shanghai, because every city is different. So what I would do is I would do a detailed study on the city, what is there, what is required in the future. And then I would do a master plan that will cater to the needs of the city for the future and build that. That's what I did for Xintiandi 20 odd years ago. I did a master plan. I studied what Shanghai has and what Shanghai will need in the future. And that's why Xintiandi, even today, it's still the most popular location in Shanghai.
Well, it's, a brief follow-up to that. So one of the things I was referring to Enrico Moretti before, and he talks about these places with these special agglomeration economies, this black magic. And New York is a place like this, and the Bay Area is a place like this, and Seattle is a place like this, and LA is for for content like this. For San Diego, it's for biotech like this. But once you get past that set of cities, there really aren't any in the United States where you see this sort of increasing returns to scale magic, where like-minded people get together and produce stuff. In China, how many cities do you think fit in that? So clearly Shanghai is a city like this. Clearly Beijing is a city like this. Clearly Guangzhou is a city like this. But could another city like this be created in China, or is it going to continue to be the cities we all know that drive the creativity that leads to the expansion of economic activity?
Richard, China, basically, the development strategy is to go for the region, right? For example, the Greater Bay Area, nearby Hong Kong, it's Hong Kong, Macau, plus 9 cities in the Guangdong province. I'm actually very, very bullish on this particular development. It's got a GDP equivalent to that of Canada and South Korea. And it's got quite unique advantages. Technology, right? Shenzhen is like a Silicon Valley. And it's got an international finance center, Hong Kong right next to it. And then it's got very strong manufacturing capabilities on the Pearl River Delta. All those combined will make this region really quite unique going forward. And I believe this region will become very competitive in world terms. And this is not just the only development plan for China. The Yangtze Delta, right? They are also doing a unification there. And then Beijing, Tianjin, and then all these places, it's going for regional economy. And I think that's going to be a big plan. So in the regional area, if you pick the right cities, that's going to take the lead, like Wuhan in the central China. And then it's Chengdu and Chongqing in the western side. So all these are cities that I think it's going to be growing very, very well and very fast. But of course, not everyone will be doing something like a Shanghai. That's much more international and cosmopolitan. A lot of cities in China have invited me to go and do a Xintiandi in their city. I said, thank you very much. You can't afford to have a Xintiandi.
Yeah.
Because you don't have the people who want that kind of lifestyle yet.
So another question from the audience: how would real estate sector adjustment in China look like for you? Let me get this right. In 2 to 3 years, in what way would stressed privately owned developers come out of the current crisis? So I think what it's saying is, yeah, I mean, you were talking about the opportunities that you see at the moment. What do things look like in 3 years?
I think in 3 years' time, the market will be back to normal. The residential side, I think, will continue to boom because Chinese people just love to buy residential flats. And then on the commercial side, I think it's location, and quality, right? The management is going to be very important. So all these, I think, will really differentiate the whole industry. But in the past 20 years, the domestic developers have really impressed and amazed me at the speed that they have developed. But now is the time the major correction is coming. So everybody will have to really upgrade themselves. Otherwise, I think they will be forced out of the market.
So here's a question about a specific sector, which is retail, which is what do you think the pandemic's impact, long-term impact on retail is? Did we lose Vincent? There we are. What do you think the impact of the pandemic will be on retail long-term? And just more generally, what is your long-term outlook for retail, particularly in light of the fact that it's getting a lot of competition, of course, we know from online sales? Is what do shopping centers look like in China in 20, 30 years?
Online sales will continue to increase. There's no doubt about that. But people have more time on their hands and they want to have the experience and the ambience. That is why Xintiandi is still so popular, right? People still come. The moment Shanghai opened, everybody swarms to Xintiandi, and we have record number of visitors the last few weeks. And I don't think people will be wanting to just stay home and buy online. So online and offline is something that we are working on to make sure that it's going to provide people with that special experience and that atmosphere that they want to go and spend time.
So I'm curious about your perspective on the following, though, with respect to retail in China. So here in the United States, as you know, we are getting older as a country very rapidly. That is also happening in China. One of the things I've studied is the impact on aging on retail sales. And what happens is basically in the U.S., when people retire, they stop buying stuff, even if they have pensions, so that their income doesn't fall very much. When they don't need to buy clothes to go to work. They don't need to buy tires on their car as often as they used to, and so on. So you see this very distinct fall off. And we have actually started to see the impact of this on retail in the U.S. Do you see anything like that in China? Or are incomes just rising so rapidly, or have been rising so rapidly in China, that you won't see that kind of change in behavior as people age?
We haven't seen that yet. But of course, China is aging very, very fast. But the rising income is making people wanting to spend money more. And the younger generation is not like the people like myself who want to save money. They basically spend everything they own, they make. So I think retail still has a long way to go in China. But I am concerned about some of the shopping malls, because if they are just sort of run-of-the-mill type of things, they will lose out. People will go to places that they feel they can have something special.
So one of the phenomena that's happened in the U.S. is for those shopping centers that have stayed successful, which is not a large number, there's been a shift away from goods to what are called broadly experiences, and what that really means is restaurants. Are we seeing that sort of shift in Chinese retail as well?
Yes, I think in the shopping malls, you're seeing more and more eateries. Roughly about 40% now. So I think food and beverage is going to be a key to any commercial properties.
And what would that share have looked like maybe 10, 20 years ago, do you think?
I think 10, 20 years ago, probably a lot more like 20%, 20-odd%, but now it's close to 50. And also we're in these commercial assets that we're doing, we are trying to create a sort of community, right? For example, we create something called Foodie Show, that people who love food will have something special in our commercial properties that they can go and experience and try out.
So I'm being waved at, which is telling me it's time for us to get off the stage. Although, Vincent, I think nobody would ever be tired of you continuing to talk, but we do have a time to keep. So, Vincent Lo, thank you very much for spending some of your time with us today.
Thank you.